shout out to Hippocamp 2018 today. The 4th annual conference is going on right now. Sounds like fun. Wish I was there instead of my little studio. As always, thanks to Hippocampus Magazine for the promotional support. Hippocampus Magazine. Create, share, live. Before we get started, I'd like to dedicate this show to the riff. The riff giveth, or something or other. Today's guest is Matthew Pauly. You can find him on Twitter at Matthew E. Pauly, or visit his website, mattpauly.com. He's the author of 3 books of nonfiction, most recently, Bruce Lee, A Life. He's a graduate of Princeton University and a Rhodes Scholar. So you can say my 1050 SAT score didn't exactly level me up in this conversation. Yeah, that's right, I got a 1050. You think you know Bruce Lee, but you have no idea. None. But after 500 pages about the Kung Fu Master, you come away knowing the whole story. In this episode, you'll learn about Matt's approach to writing biography, taking risks, how comedy writing and screenwriting helped Matt find his voice, as well as who was his most influential writer as he developed as a writer himself. But before we get to that, I'll let you know that I'm kind of hanging up my editing writing coach shingle. If you have an essay that needs development, something needs to get you over the hump, or a book manuscript that needs help, look no further. Right now, I'm paying good money, for me, to have my terrible memoir looked at, and it's a way better book than it was just a few months ago. I've been working on the thing for 9 years off and on, and only now does it look a little bit better than that Voldemort baby from the final Harry Potter movie. If you need similar help, email me and we'll start a dialogue. Sound like fun? Also, be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. If you're feeling generous, ratings and reviews are super helpful. But if you merely share with a friend, that's every bit as good. I think you're going to want to hang around for the ride, people. Got some major headliners coming up. So buckle up right now, put your hands at 10 and 2 in the wheel, and listen to Matthew Pauly. Where did you grow up, and what kind of kid were you?
I was born in Dallas, Texas, but I moved to Topeka, Kansas when I was 4. And I was this basically kind of a shy, sensitive, bookish little kid. So I guess it's appropriate that I ended up writing books, because that's what I loved to bury myself in when I was a child.
What kind of books were you into?
Sci-fi, fantasy, comic books, anything that sort of took me out of Topeka, Kansas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I find that a lot of people who become writers oftentimes are immersed in books at a young age, because that's the one place where they could get that escapism and kind of lose themselves in it. And was there ever a point when you were younger where you were like, I love these books so much that maybe one day this is something I'd love to take up as a vocation?
Yeah, I think the only thing I ever wanted to do was be a writer, because I love books so much. But, I grew up in Kansas, and writer was not a profession that was considered an option. So yeah. I always thought I would be like, a businessman or a lawyer or something like that. And it wasn't until very late that I decided, you know what, go for it. There are at least 2 people I know that could make a living at it. Let's maybe you can be one of them.
Right. And what did your parents do?
My father was a doctor, and my mother was a homemaker.
Mm-hmm. Was there any pressure from say your father to kind of follow in that sort of in those footsteps?
Yeah. He definitely wanted me to be a doctor or some equivalent. I remember when I finally, essentially came out to him and said, I want to be a writer. He took me aside and said, son, I'm really worried about you. So it was like this. I was disappointing him that I was doing this, and making him extremely anxious about my fate and future. And to be fair, he wasn't wrong. Being a writer is a scary, unstable profession, unlike being a doctor. So he had a point.
Yeah, what gave you the courage to be able to tell him that you actually wanted to follow something that was more congruent with your drive and your goals instead of going down a sort of tried and true, well-worn path of standard success, if you will?
Because I'd done something risky before and it had worked out. I went to the Shaolin Temple for 2 years back in the 90s when China was still a scary place to go to. And he had disapproved, and I had fought with him over that. And it had worked out. And so my thought was, if I can survive the Shaolin Temple for 2 years, I can make it as a writer.
Wow. Yeah. And when you were younger, what did a successful writer look like to you?
Probably Stephen King.
Yeah. Yeah.
Somebody who writes novels that get turned into big time movies and sells millions and millions of copies. And is also, and this still annoys me to this day, so extremely prolific that even if one of his books doesn't do so well, the next book is out in like 6 months. So, yeah, I remember thinking Stephen King was like what every writer was basically like,
Yeah.
not realizing he was one of a generation.
Of course, yeah. And did you as you were starting to develop that writerly muscle, did your view of success change, and like how did you start to define it, and what would feel satisfactory to you as a writer going forward?
I decided my feeling about writing is a little like a stand-up comic. And this is probably because I started off as a humor writer.
Mm-hmm.
Is that if the audience laughs, then the joke's funny. It doesn't matter if you think it's funny or your two friends think it's funny. What matters is the reaction of the readers. And of course, you never get 100% one way or another, but you can get a sense from something you've written whether or not you get a positive reaction from readers or not. And so for me, to this day, I don't feel confident in a book until after the the first couple weeks or month or two, when you get to see the comments on Amazon, what people sort of tweet about, and the reviews, and then you get a sense, oh, this worked. Or you get a sense, I've had my second book kind of bombed, and pretty quickly when it's not working. So that's my view.
And when you were coming up as a writer, was there any person in particular who took a shine to you and gave you the validation and support to say, keep going, Matt?
It was probably the most important thing for me was I got a blurb from PJ O'Rourke on my first book. And I like to joke that when I was young, I wanted to be the liberal PJ O'Rourke, like less funny and more liberal than him. And I succeeded. But PJ O'Rourke was one of the people I really wanted to be like, the kind of crazy gonzo travel writer who goes crazy places, does crazy things, and writes really smart but funny pieces about them. And I used to, go get Rolling Stone hoping that he would be in that issue. And so he was sort of my role model in my early career.
All right, so yeah, you mentioned him. Who are some of the other people in the nonfiction space maybe that you were reading and be like, oh man, like when I see that byline from him or her, it's just like, I know I'm in for a good ride.
PJ was definitely the most important one, but I also like George Plimpton, Tom Wolfe. I mean, by the time I was coming up, Tom Wolfe had switched to fiction, but I would go back and read his old stuff. So I really like the new journalists. Taking nonfiction and making it read almost like fiction. And I felt like my goal at that time was to be a kind of a new journalist magazine writer / book writer. And that was before the internet destroyed magazines. But that's the kind of writer I'd like to be. The other thing I should mention is that initially I first thought I was going to be a screenwriter.
Hmm.
And so Quentin Tarantino was a role model back in the Pulp Fiction days. And so the first thing I ever wrote was actually a screenplay.
Nice. And what did that teach you about structure and pacing of a narrative and teasing out scenes?
I think it was extremely useful in retrospect. I mean, the first most important thing it taught me was that I didn't actually want to be a screenwriter, because that's an awful field. Not because screenwriting itself is it's almost like a sonnet. It's very structured, but the business model around screenwriting and the ranking you have in the industry is what makes screenwriting, I think, awful. But it turned out to be really useful because people who read my books often say, I could see this as a movie. And that's clearly an influence of having spent a lot of time thinking about how screenplays work, is that the need to construct scenes, use dialogue, and also have a plot structure. And so one of the things I look for in nonfiction stories is kind of what's the arc of this.
When you're vetting out your stories and looking for things that might sort of spark your taste, what is it you're looking for in a little blurb or something that kind of clicks in your brain? You're like, oh, there might be something more here. Like, what does that look like for you?
That's a great question. I don't know if there's an answer to it. It's almost intuitive. And I think with Bruce Lee, what I realized is that his death was the key to the story. And everybody wanted to talk about like what a great martial artist he was, and he certainly was. But what's dramatic about the story is it's a young man who dies at the peak of his powers. And so when I realized we should start the story with his funeral and then go back to the beginning, that gives the whole thing a dramatic push because the audience has this sense of dread as they know where the story is going.
Yeah, that's always something. It's almost like kind of like right now, I would say like Better Call Saul and Breaking Bad. Like you're watching, how Breaking Bad ends and where that goes, and then you have this Better Call Saul element, this prequel thing, and you're in that world, but ultimately it's going to collide with a timeline that's very fatal to a lot of these people. So it's like you were just saying with this dread. It's like where it ends, but you're still like rooting for them for a different outcome, even though the outcome.
That's right. The dramatic irony of it is a powerful force. It can kill a prequel. I think it killed the first Star Wars, the prequel Star Wars 1, 2, and 3.
Yeah.
So it has to be delivered right. But yes, I think that's what I felt was that's a novelistic technique. But you can apply that to nonfiction, and the great thing is if you find the right story, reality is often more interesting than fiction, because it's just weird and quirky.
Yeah, like the one fight that Bruce and
Wong Jack Man.
Yeah, and that fight, because it's just so wacky and bizarre that one of the rivals would just turn and run, and then you just picture Bruce chasing after him.
Right.
And it's so antithetical to what you think between like two martial arts masters, but one just ends up just turning and running about facing.
Yes, that for me. And there have been so many movies about it, and not a single person has a movie maker or filmmaker has done the real story, because, and it's been written down, like people knew that at least Linda Lee's side believes this is what happened, and nobody's ever done that because it's so weird. And in a movie, it would make people laugh out loud and destroy whatever sort of tone they're trying to set in that movie. But in a book, it works, and it's hilarious. I mean. And the truth is, I've been in a couple challenge fights, and people do weird things because they're terrified. No matter how good a martial arts master you are, you're scared because you don't know what's going to happen. So, yes, that's a perfect example. That's a totally bizarre moment in the book.
And kind of echoing Fight Club or something, there's a line in there that I'm butchering, of course, but it's kind of like a man kind of doesn't really know who he is until he's been in a fight. And you've trained a lot of in the martial arts ever since you were a kid, and I wonder what did that just teach you about rigor and discipline? And what did you learn about yourself over the course of decades of martial arts training?
One of the things you learn is that that quote itself, I think, is wrong because it reveals a part of yourself,
Mm.
which is it, some people who are very courageous will break in a fight, and some people who are total cowards will get really strong in a fight, and that just tells you one aspect of the character. I'm sure Wong Jack Man, you give him 10 times to do the same thing over again, he only runs once. But what it taught me is that uh, my experience with fighting taught me that fear does brings out extreme reactions, and so one of the things that makes it interesting dramatically is that it encourages extreme behavior, and that's of course interesting to see.
Mm. And I read once that you said that you were kind of a dojo hopper growing up, going from like Aikido, Taekwondo, and everything. So I wonder, like, what particular disciplines resonated with you the most?
When I was younger, I was kind of a cowardly, skinny, bullied kid. And so I got into the martial arts very specifically wanting to sort of find my own courage, so that I didn't have to feel afraid. And so I was most interested in styles that seemed most realistic. And the style I really liked the most was Chinese kickboxing when I was at the Shaolin Temple, because all the guys who did it were the tough guy fighter types. And the styles that are softer, like Tai Chi or Aikido, or the styles that are more flashy, like Wushu, didn't have as much interest for me because I really wanted the kind of gritty, knock somebody's head off stuff.
Mm. So what brings you to the Shaolin Temple in 93?
The Shaolin Temple really was, I wanted to not be afraid. It was pretty much that simple. I probably had read too many comic books, and I wanted to be a kind of super heroic figure in my own brain. And so I thought if I went and learned Kung Fu at the Shaolin Temple, I could be like David Carradine in Kung Fu, this kind of deadly, unstoppable figure. And so that's why I went and did it.
At that point, had you been familiar with a lot of Plimpton's work and that participatory journalism at that point?
No, I didn't know anything about that. I'd read PJ O'Rourke prior to going to China, so I guess I knew it through him. But most of my influence was sort of stand-up comics, and so PJ O'Rourke fit into that as a humorist. I didn't really understand new journalism until much later.
Hmm. At what point did you realize that you had something worth writing about there, given that experience?
I didn't realize it for a long time because there was a part of me who was embarrassed by the idea of doing something first person. And so when I initially what happened was I wanted to be a writer and I wanted to write other stuff. And I was thinking about screenwriting, and a friend of mine was a book editor, and he was like, "You need to turn your Shaolin story into a book." And that was mostly because I just wouldn't shut up about my experiences at Shaolin. And so people kept asking me, like, did you take extensive notes? And it really wasn't that. It was that the experience had seared itself onto my brain and wouldn't let go. And so I talked about it incessantly. And so in many ways, the first draft of my book, American Shaolin, was oral. I'd just been telling different parts of that story to people over the years. And I think I honed the material, gauging it in like just live conversation.
Mm.
And so it was much more of a kind of informal stand-up routine that I had. And then I sat down to try to write the book. And initially, I tried to write it just about the monks and leave myself out of it. And my editor said, American audience needs you to be the narrator who takes them through this experience.
Mm-hmm.
And at first I found it kind of terrifying, like walking down the street naked.
Yeah. Yeah.
To do a first person and kind of reveal your inner thoughts and fears. But once you do it often enough, you become kind of a nudist, so that you're suddenly comfortable being totally naked while everybody else is clothed. And now, of course, the internet has come along with social media, so we're all nudists now.
Right.
But back then, writing a memoir felt scary to me for that reason, because you were exposing parts of yourself.
And how did you change from the person who traveled to a foreign country to the person who then came home a couple years later? What was the marked change that you noticed in yourself?
I think the biggest change was the level of confidence and willingness to take risk. I think what happens when you're kind of a bright kid who does well in school and then goes to an Ivy League college is the entire system turns you into a bit of a risk averse tool, and you're just looking for what's the next step up the ladder. And the advantage to me of going to China was I had stepped off the ladder for 2 years and gone to the Shaolin Temple and done something that wasn't, part of an obvious path towards being, a Wall Street executive or a white shoe lawyer. And having broken the pattern, then it was easier to do it again the second time. Mm. And I think for a lot of people, if you have some success, you're terrified of losing it. And that makes you risk averse. And there's one of the great advantages in life is to totally fail at something and get back up. And that allows you to think of the world in a different way.
Do you have a particular favorite failure that taught you that lesson very viscerally?
Well, my second book failed, and so that taught me a very, very visceral lesson, which is don't do it twice. You don't want two books to fail in a row. But also, when you fail, you get to have a chance to examine what went wrong, and you don't. It's much harder to examine what went right with a book that does well, because you don't really know. But when something fails in a piece of writing, it keeps you up at night, and so your brain goes around and around, and you learn sort of, this actually worked, but in this context, it's still a failure. So you can kind of parse out what works and what didn't.
Were you at Princeton before you went to China and then went back?
I withdrew from Princeton after my junior year, and I planned to only stay for like a year and then come back. And then I ended up staying a second year, which totally terrified my parents. They thought I was going to be some wandering non-college graduate in Asia. And then by the end of the second year, I was like, okay, I get it. I think I've gotten what I wanted out of it. And it was time to return home. And so then I returned to Princeton, finished it off, and then got a scholarship and went to grad school.
And where did you go to grad school again? I'm sorry, I missed that.
Yeah, I went to Oxford.
Oh, okay. Very nice. And hence the Rhodes Scholar chapter of your life. So, so how did you?
That's right.
Yeah. So that's the next chapter. So like, how did you get there, and what did you take away from that? What were you studying and trying to develop over there in grad school?
At grad school, I actually took a second BA, and so it wasn't particularly challenging. And the advantage of that is by that point, I really was dedicated to wanting to be a writer. And so I spent almost all my time working on my masterpiece screenplay that will never see the light of day. But was my first it was my first true love, the first thing you write that you love so much and you think so amazing, and no one else will ever see it. So I was there for 3 years. And I wrote it in the first 2 years, and then I went out to Hollywood and stayed with a friend. And I thought, I'll give it about 2 months, sell the screenplay, live in Malibu, date hot celebrity girls. And I very quickly realized that it's what an awful business being a screenwriter is. And also, I was skipping steps in the process. And this is what I think was an important lesson for me as a writer, is that book writing and screenwriting are the high end of the writing market, and I hadn't yet done the like legwork. I hadn't worked on horse stance, as it were, often enough, and so I realized I should go to New York and start getting clips and write short things for publications and build up a professional reputation first, and then at some stage you get to go and get a book contract or get a movie deal, and that I had tried to jump in front of the line, basically.
So yeah, what did that start to look like as you put your boots on the ground and sort of develop some repertorial chops that would eventually lead to what you're able to do with your book work? But what were those early growing pains like as you were trying to amass a body of work?
Well, part of the early growing pains is this was prior to the internet, so I had to go buy a book that had it listed all the publications in the country, and by section. And so I looked at like the humor section, and there were 4 publications. So the first thing I ever sold was to The Door magazine, which was the country's only religious satire magazine. And it came out of Texas, and it was published once a month. And I did a fake column about ask Reverend Retentive. And so people would ask this, kind of evangelical idiot advice, and then he would give idiotic advice in return. And I sent them one. I wrote the piece and I sent it to them, and they loved it, and they signed me up for a column. And I would spend 3 weeks, literally, like 50 hours writing them for $100 an article. But I got published, and 4 people read it. But it didn't matter to me. I was happier than I could ever be. So that was the first thing I ever did.
That's great. And how did you then start to create some momentum for yourself? What was your routine like as you're drawing up query letters and seeing where else you can try to land work and pitch stories? Like, how did you manifest that?
I think the most important thing I ended up doing was I went to this journalism program. It was at Harvard then. It's now at Columbia, basically because I wanted to go to New York. And the way I thought about it was, if you want to learn Kung Fu, you go to the Shaolin Temple. And if you want to be in media, you go to New York City or LA. And so I went to this publishing program, and I met a lot of other people who were also wanted to get into the business. And so I just lived in New York, and friends of those friends and other friends, you would talk to them, and that's where most of the job offers came after sort of I initially got going. So, for example, I had a friend who worked at Publishers Weekly, and she would get me book reviews. I never would have tried to write book reviews without knowing someone. And so I don't know if this is different writers have different approaches, but I sort of approached it as an inside game that you work in the industry, and that's how you get ahead.
When you're doing your research and everything, trying to formulate a story and kind of all that information gathering, how do you go about organizing your notes and your work so then you can access it best, so you can then get the writing done?
I'm really bad about that. I mean, there's a lot of people who are much more organized than I am. I basically take notes on note cards, like Oxford note cards. And so if I have an idea, when I was younger, like if I had a joke or an idea, I would write it down on a note card, and then I would have these stacks of them, and then I'd kind of page through them and get an idea going. For Bruce Lee, because it was such a huge biography, I had to take a different approach, and basically I created a single Word document that contained every note I had in chronological order. And so that was, it turned out to be like 2,000 pages and over 1 million words. So that was really massive. But in the old days, I used note cards, and this is not a very good method for most writers, but I felt like memory was a very good editor. If you go, for example, since I was doing participatory stuff, my feeling was if I couldn't remember it, the reader wouldn't be interested in it anyway.
Mm.
So I would sort of jot down things that happened, but I would mostly rely on things that like struck in my memory. And then I would go and sit around with friends and retell stories and see which stories worked with them. So again, I approached it more like a stand-up comic in my early years, and now that I'm writing kind of longer things, I have to be more disciplined about note taking.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly the comedian approach. Like just what you said. Like you're kind of, it's like when all these comedians are working on an hour and they go to the comedy store and they're gonna do a little 20-minute set and they're just kind of feeling it out. Like, okay, the audience they really dug this one, so let's make a note and keep that and keep building on that. So that's kind of like a really great way to sort of crowdsource what's gonna work in a sense.
Yeah, and I think that's important for writers because a lot of writers, you write it, you spend all this time alone, and then you give it to the one person you totally love and trust, who's most likely not going to want to hurt your feelings, and that's not a big enough audience. Yeah, even if they're going to tell you the truth, it's only a subset of one. So that's the problem with writing, is that it's you need to get at least 10 people to read your stuff so you can get a sense of like, this has got a 70% approval rating, rotten tomato it.
Right. And when you're conducting interviews, are you using a voice recorder, or do you just straight use note taking?
In the old days, I just used note taking because I was in kind of more live situations, and it would have destroyed the experience. For example, my second book, Tapped Out, I spent 6 months at a gymnasium, and so there's no way to record 6 months of time unless I guess you're the NSA. So, so I would basically just go there, and most days nothing interesting happened, but every once in a while somebody would say something interesting, and then I'd run home and write it in a notebook. And that's, I think, the most ideal for getting the way life really lives, because there's few things that make people pucker up more than like putting a tape recorder in front of them,
right?
And pulling out a notebook. When I did Bruce Lee, there was no choice because there's no way I interviewed over 100 people. You can't spend 6 months with each one of them waiting for them to tell you the nugget of truth that you've been waiting for. So for that type of book, I did. Yeah, I would just go there and put the tape recorder down. And the thing I would say to people I was interviewing is, you want me to tape record this. Mm-hmm. Like, you don't realize this, but your fear isn't that you're going to say something wrong. It's that my memory won't be right. And I won't get what you exactly said word for word. It's much better that there's an accurate portrayal of something that you're uncomfortable that you said than me and my brain trying to recreate what I think you said, 6 months or a year later when I'm trying to write it down.
And do you transcribe yourself, or do you sort of employ a service to do that?
When the old days, I used to transcribe it myself, and then I realized that it's such an awful process. Yeah. That it would mean I would try to do less interviews just because I knew it was going to be so terrible. So there's a place on the internet that you pay them like $1 a minute or something like that. Yeah. And they finish it in a week. And that's, once I realized that, I was, it's like when you're young and you would go stay in budget motels or hostels. Yeah. And then you get to a certain age and you're like, if I can't afford to stay in a decent hotel, I'm just not going to go travel to that place. And that's my feeling now. Like, I'm at the age where if I can't afford to pay somebody $1 a minute to transcribe it, I don't want to interview you.
Yeah.
So
that's brilliant. And when you're starting to organize this, your notes and your note cards, are you outlining or using cork boards or anything of that nature to start seeing where the narrative blocks are?
No, for Bruce Lee, I did that afterwards. Mm-hmm. So I put all the notes in and kind of slammed them randomly into a section. And then when I got to a chapter, say Bruce Lee's teenage years, I knew that was going to be basically one chapter. I went and took all the notes from the master document which is like 2,000 pages long, and I got to say 60 pages of notes that just covered his teenage years. And then I cut and paste that into a different Word document and read through it, and reading the various quotes from different people and different books. Then I started to develop what the outline was. So I got a sense like, oh, we should do martial arts here, cha-cha dancing there, girl dating, and then I'd work the outline. But I really, for me at least, feel it's important to let the writing determine the outline rather than the other way around. I have a lot of friends who are very, rigid about the outline first. But I often feel that the writing will tell you where you should go. So the outline to me is just a very loose guide.
And when you're in the throes of writing a book of this nature, it's a massive book, a massive undertaking. How did you stay sort of motivated throughout, even as you were starting to get into like the middle of the draft, where it's just you're too far away to turn home and you're so far away from the finish line that you just kind of feel lost in the material? So how did you kind of keep going once you were in the ugly middles?
Video games.
Nice.
It took 7 years to write. It could have taken 5, because there was about a year and a half of just, I don't know why I'm doing this feeling. This sucks. And it compared to like a marathon runner. There's a point where your side hurts and you don't want to keep going. And about 3 or 4 years in, I was like, yeah, Bruce, he's boring. And he's not, but it's just because I'd done nothing else for 3 or 4 years. And even if you eat the best cake, eventually you get sick of it if it's meal after meal. And so for me, I ended up just having to work through that emotion and let it play out. And eventually I regained my excitement for the subject matter. But there were months where I didn't put a word down on paper, and my wife would come in and just look at me and kind of walk out of the room. Like, I don't want to have to deal with you today, son. I know you didn't, this is like week 8 of you not writing anything. And I have very good friends who every morning get up and do their 600 words. And I really hate those people. They're really awful. And they always tell you, oh yeah, I do 400 words a day. And then I go out and do Pilates. So I can't do that. It's all passion for me. So when the passion rolls and I'm excited, then the words roll. And when it wanes, then I'm deadlocked for a while, and I just have to wait until that ends.
Yeah, I've heard conversations with Cheryl Strayed where she likens herself. She's a 100% binge writer and does not apologize for it. She'll just like hole up in a hotel room over a weekend and just do her massive undertaking over the course of 2 or 3 days instead of doing the 400 or 600 every single day for a year. So it sounds like you're more along the lines of following your energy and also kind of just binge writing when you have the momentum at your back.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And I'm totally that type, and I joke about it because it would be nice as a human being to be a consistent type. But we all figure out the one good thing about doing something long enough is you figure out what works for you. And there's no single method. You eventually figure it out. And so when I got depressed, I went and played Fallout for a month, and it helped. Like, I played Fallout 3 or 4, and probably both in the time that it took 7 years to write. And then when it kind of cleared my brain out, and then I was ready to go at it again. But when you're doing it and the advance money's run out, you do feel pretty close to being unemployed and like a bum. So that's the struggle. I think a lot of people like if I do 300 words a day thing, because it makes them feel like they're a productive member of society. And I think one of the things that's important for writers to accept is that we're not productive members of society, and the attempt to feel like we are often drives us crazier than if we just accepted that fact.
Yeah, that's great. I love that you have a way that you choose to unplug from something that's as big as this story was, whether it be video games. Some people employ long walks, or we'll just find another artistic media or something else to unplug from. So you mentioned video games. Is there anything else that you like to employ to, just get out of your own head, step away from the stories? You can approach it with some freshness.
Video games and bad TV. Mm-hmm. And so that's one of the other weird things about being a writer is people are always like, what books do you like to read? And you're like, none. Because when you're reading somebody else's book, you're thinking about your own sentences and what you can adopt and whatever. And so I like any form of media that isn't exactly mine. The other thing I will say this though, I love magazines still, and I like articles that are about sort of 4,000 to 5,000 words long. I think anything under 1,000 is, just basically giving you facts. And they're no longer as many as there used to be, but long form journalism, 5,000 words is some of the best writing in this country because they were edited so rigorously. And one of the things people don't realize is that most books aren't edited very rigidly. The publishers don't have enough money to pay editors to really go after stuff. And that's why you'll read so many books that you're like, oh, this is a great first chapter, second chapter. Whoa. Whoa. Oh, they're just repeating themselves, aren't they? Oh, man, nobody looked at chapter 8, did they? And so one of the things I looked for when I was looking for an editor for Bruce Lee was somebody who'd come from the magazine business, because that really taught people how to edit harshly. So if I read anything, it's actually magazines, the New Yorker, New York Magazine, or websites like the Daily Beast or things like that. And I watch bad TV and I play video games.
Nice. I love it. You wrote in the afterword of Bruce Lee too that as when I began this project as a rookie biographer, Alex Ben Block, the author of The Legend of Bruce Lee, kindly gave me a few pointers. And what was that? Like you said, a rookie biographer not knowing how to maybe approach it, and then you've got the mythos of a Bruce Lee, so you've got like a double whammy there, like pressure. So what did Alex tell you and coach you about along the process of writing this book?
He didn't say a lot. I mean, the biggest thing for me was he was one of the first people I called up, and he was willing to do the interview. So that just gave me a bit of confidence boost. But really, what he did that I thought was useful is he said, here are the people you need to talk to. Mm-hmm. And it reminded me that each form has its own rules. And in biography, it's really like, go do the work. There are a bunch of people to talk to, and just do it. And I realized afterwards that biography is kind of the coal mining of literature. You really just have to go into the mind and dig, and you get a certain amount of coal every day, and every once in a while you find a gem. And it's different from when I was doing memoir. It's about finding an interesting experience and then telling it in an entertaining way. And so the telling it in the entertaining way is actually where the art is. In biography, the most important part of it is the thoroughness of the research. And then secondarily, it's turning that research into a readable story. But it's a grind. And there was somebody else who was working on a biography, and he was also like teaching classes and doing lectures. And I was like, dude, you're never going to finish it, because it actually just requires this relentlessness and obsessiveness. And it differs from other forms of writing where you can get by on cleverness.
And what did your days look like as you were going from interview to interview? What did when were you getting up in the morning, and then just what was the shape of your days as you were doing the research for this book?
So I spent about 6 months in Hong Kong, and that I hired an assistant to help me with it, because I speak Mandarin, the northern dialect, but not Cantonese, the southern dialect. And so, in Hong Kong, they speak kind of broken English but mostly Cantonese. uh, and every day was like basically getting up and talking to her and seeing like who have we lined up and strategizing. Oh, if we talk to so and so, we can get to so and so. And so the research felt a lot more like a hustle with this book, because it was also the first book I've written about somebody who was famous. And what's interesting about that is the best people to interview are people who have never been interviewed before, because they're happy to talk to you. You find somebody on the street and you say, "Hey, I'd like to interview you about such and such." They're excited. This makes their day. They're going to tell their family, "I got interviewed by a journalist." And they have no guile because they've never done it before. So they're most likely going to tell you the truth. When you deal with celebrities or people who are close to celebrities who've been interviewed a lot of times, they're either resistant, or they're jaded, or they've got their story down, which makes them less interesting to interview, frankly. But you have to do it because that's, that the brother of Bruce Lee is the brother of Bruce Lee. You can't skip him just because he's done 100 interviews before.
Yeah. Who were some of the, that quote unquote, like regular people you were able to track down that gave you some of that, that really, the good coal as from the mine?
The gems that felt great to me were, what I tried to do was get to the people who'd written books about Bruce first, and then use them to get to the people who were close to Bruce. And when I went to Hong Kong, Bruce went to LaSalle, which was an elite parochial school. So I called up LaSalle and said, I want to do a book about Bruce. Do you know anybody there who's has any information? And they gave me to the guy who wrote the history book about the college, the high school. And he never had anybody from America come want to talk to him about Bruce Lee. So he was super excited. And it turned out he was doing interviews about Bruce Lee for the next newsletter about LaSalle. And so he had arranged interviews with Bruce's classmates. And I just went along with him. And Bruce's classmates had never been interviewed about Bruce.
Wow.
And that was just gold because they had, Bruce was kind of having read the book, kind of a punkish pain in the butt kid.
Yeah.
He was a troublemaker. He was the guy in the back of the class shooting spitballs at everybody. And so they had this really ambivalent feeling about this guy who they remember being a bit of a terror, who turns out to be the most famous Asian American to ever live, and everybody idolizes. So they're like, basically all I had to do was show I didn't care, that they didn't have to tell me the glossy version. I didn't care. You tell me he was a jerk, that's fine. I'm going to write it down. You were there, I wasn't. I'm not prejudging what you have to say. And once they realized they could tell me whatever they felt like, they just kind of held forth. And so that was great because I feel like Bruce's childhood has never been adequately covered. And part of that is people just didn't do the work to track down his classmates.
Yeah, I think people just want to lean into this almost like Zen master ideal of who Bruce was. And that's something that immediately, I just knew what you saw on posters and mouse pads or whatever.
Right.
And so reading your book, I was like, wow, this guy is a whole lot, warts and all, is so much different than I had known. Cause you hear the quotes, the be like water, the don't be as, go to simplicity and eschew. It's very minimalistic in a sense. So you get,
right.
But in so many ways, he was at times a jerk, very materialistic and almost outwardly driven and prideful. So it's almost like you were able to expose a lot of these great things that make him a more well-rounded person.
Yeah, that was the goal. I mean, the goal is to be honest. And that the one thing I try to remember as a writer is the person you owe the most is the reader who spent $23 and 10 hours of their life with your subject. And I think that that's something that particularly journalists forget, is they get too attached to their subjects or their sources. And they worry, if I say this source is going to get angry. and so I won't ever get to talk to them again, right? In this kind of access journalism. And I think the important thing is the reader who spent the money and is going to spend the time, you owe them the truth. And so that was my approach with Bruce. And what I found out is that he's like everybody else. He was preaching the things he needed to practice. He knew he was a hot-tempered guy, and that's why water was important to him, because he was trying to modify his own behavior.
Yeah, of course. And over the course of your research and your interviews, and you had your vision as a 12-year-old kid watching Enter the Dragon in your basement, probably wearing the VCR tape thin.
Yeah.
So so you obviously had a preconceived idea of who he was before you started your own martial arts training, and then of course writing the book. So what surprised you most about Bruce Lee's life as you got deep into the research?
What I realized is that because his fame was entirely posthumous, people worked backwards in telling his story, which is to say, they saw Enter the Dragon, they thought Bruce was amazing, and then they saw the next three movies, Fist of Fury, Big Boss, and Way of the Dragon, and then they stopped. And so you will still read articles where they say Bruce Lee's fame was based on 4 movies, or he only made 4 movies in his life. And what I realized that amazed me was sitting in the Hong Kong Film Archives watching the 20 films he had made as a child actor. That taught me that Bruce Lee was an actor first, and then became a martial artist, and then merged those two passions. But when I thought of him as an actor, all of the quirky things you mentioned, like the materialism, the womanizing, the bit of the drug use, that all made sense, because as an actor in Hollywood in the 60s, that was just part of the culture. The problem was people started with him as the Zen master guru in Enter the Dragon, and then they went backwards, and anything that didn't fit that archetype, they deleted out of the story. And if you start with him as an actor, then actually his behavior makes perfect sense. And it's not too extreme. It's perfectly sort of moderate for the time and the place. And then it fits in. An actor becomes obsessed with some activity and becomes a genius at it.
Yeah, what surprised me also was that his fame was posthumous, that he didn't get to, he had this vision of himself of being Steve McQueen, and he never got to live it out. I knew he died tragically, but I didn't know that he didn't get to at least reap the benefits of the hard-won fame. And it's just one of those things that makes the arc of his life that much more kind of tragic, because he didn't get to see it out.
Yeah, I thought it was almost like John Henry, like he beat the steam machine with the last stroke of his hammer and then dies.
Yeah.
And so I think one of the compelling things about the story itself is it almost feels like there are several morals you can take from it, but somebody who dedicates themselves to this, extreme ambition, the idea that as an Asian actor you could become bigger than the most famous white box office star in the world. And to actually achieve that, but only the moment after you die. And that feels like that feels sort of mythic. And that's, I think, one of the reasons why Bruce's story has such sort of resonance, and also why ultimately you can't tell his story without telling his death as well, because that's intimately tied to his legend. If he'd lived to be 80, he'd still be famous, but it'd be a totally different story arc. And so that's why the death was so important to get down.
Yeah, and that was the machinations and how you were able to tell that was a really gripping part of the book. I think I first came across it actually was the excerpt on The Ringer. And so it was probably early June or maybe late May when I read that. I'm like, oh, I gotta get my hands on this book because this is something I'd never heard. And the way you were able to craft that scene of how, trying to cover it up, move his body, this, that, and the other, and to try to make it not look as salacious as it was, because the Hong Kong press would have just feasted on it, which of course they did anyway. But it was what was it like for you to build that scene and get that tight and right?
That was one of the hardest parts of the book to write. I could have shaved a year off of this book if somebody had done this before, and I just could have synthesized what someone else said.
Right.
But the problem was everybody involved in the cover-up is still semi-involved in the cover-up.
Mm-hmm.
So, I went and talked to Betty Ting Pei, to Raymond Chow, and to Linda Lee, and their current versions of stories still have holes in them. And in particular, when I talked to Raymond Chow, I realized, he's not going to break and tell me what I'm pretty sure the truth is. He's going to stick with the version that he had been telling for the last 35 years. But even though that happened, he still revealed details that were crucial in understanding the final day. For example, that Bruce had been performing scenes from Game of Death, and that had made him feel dizzy. That had never been reported before, and that gave me a kind of insight into what might have caused Bruce's death. But you're right, writing that last thing was difficult because it was the only area of the book where I had to, as an author, say, you know what, this is what they're saying, but I'm pretty sure they're not telling the truth or it's wrong. And so I'm going to have to speculate a little bit, but look at the footnotes and I'll let you know why I'm doing that and what the theory is. But it required a little more educated guessing than others because it was the one area where the principals involved were being dishonest. It also helped, though, that I had a couple sources who were close to it who could kind of guide me as well. And
I've heard you say, and also you wrote it in the afterword, that the genesis of this biography kind of stemmed from your own anger that nothing of this nature had been written about Bruce Lee. And I was wondering if maybe you could speak to that, because it's a really good point that you talk about how and perhaps why nothing of this nature has been written about him, 45 years after his death.
Yeah, I think there's two big reasons. The lesser reason is because Kung Fu itself is not considered highbrow. The martial arts, despite the fact that they're a universal phenomenon and there's over 20 million Americans who study them, is not considered highbrow culture. And I joke that if Bruce Lee had been a painter or a violinist, and 20 million people had taken up violin because of him, he would have had 500 biographies, but because he was a kung fu star, he only gets one.
Yeah.
And then I think the second reason is pretty obvious, is that he's not white. But I think it's even more complicated than that. He's also not black. And I believe sort of American culture deals with race in this basic binary. And so the result is any white guy who does anything gets a biography, and any black person who white people know gets a biography, but Asians get ignored. And so even if you tried to think in your brain of, name me three famous Asians, you'd probably go Bruce Lee, Chairman Mao, and then you'd struggle for the third name. So Asian Americans haven't had the sort of exposure in Western media that the other ethnic groups have, or racial groups, and also they just aren't treated as worthy of that much attention. And so Bruce Lee's really, when I picked him out, I realized, after you've written about Bruce Lee, you're done, because there's not a second person you can write about. So I hope that changes. But it's remarkable that 45 years after Enter the Dragon, Bruce Lee remains pretty much the only super famous Asian American in the world.
When you took up this project, how did you lobby, the principals involved, namely the estate and the family, to to let you tell the story?
I had heard that from various sources that the estate wasn't super excited about biographies about Bruce Lee.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not unusual. Most estates are uncomfortable with biographies because, they're in the business of controlling the image of the dead celebrity who generates the income. And also, they're often run by family members who have an emotional connection. So what I did was I basically got the book deal first, and then I got a magazine article attached to it. At that point, the New York Times Magazine had agreed to do a piece on the 40th anniversary of Enter the Dragon. So I approached them with that, saying I'm going to write this piece for the New York Times and also probably do a biography. And so because it was a fait accompli, they agreed to talk to me, but Shannon Lee, who runs the estate, was clearly not super comfortable with the idea that it would be an independent biography.
Mm. And is that so? What then becomes the difference? I'm a little confused of what it means, what is it? Authoritative, authorized or non-authorized biographies. And I take it like this was as extensive as it is, and the amount of people that you talked to that were so close to Bruce. Like, is this considered a non-authorized biography?
So authorized is very specific. It means you went to the estate itself and got their approval, and then it varies, but basically you have to give up some editorial control.
Right.
So it could mean that they had final approval, which means they said, I don't want you putting the thing about the mistress. You have to cut that out, and you would. Usually it's more subtle than that. Usually the estate does something like, we'll agree to let you our archives of photos. We'll let you look at letters, and then, we'll be involved in the final product. But, writers know where their bread is buttered. And if you agree to an authorized thing, you're just going to pull your punches a little bit. That's that's inevitable. So it's what we call access journalism, which is the people who get to talk to the president are all on Fox News. Right.
Right.
And the people who talked to Obama were on MSNBC. You go, an estate wants a biographer who's going to write nice things about the guy. And so inevitably, with somebody famous enough, you'll have an authorized biography, and then you'll have usually one sort of bitter, nasty tell-all. And then hopefully you get one book, and this is what I was aiming for, which feels like a balance between the two. It's going to tell you some of the warts, but it's also going to tell you why this person's impressive. And that's what I was going for. It's an independent, but you lose some access. So the estate didn't grant me the rights to use any of their photos. And there were parts of their archives I had to access other ways. And so it took more time and money to do it this way.
Mm. And given the amount of time that you spent on the book and really immersed in Bruce's life, when it was all said and done, did you get a sense of like, I kind of like miss this guy, or were you like ready to kick him out the door?
Well, that happened like year 3, where I was like, you don't call around here no more, Brucey. But no, I mean, what happens, I got excited again, and as the day of like publication approached, I was at peak excitement. And then getting a chance to talk to you and to other people about Bruce is awesome. This is, as I said, writing is so awful to do, like it's so torturous, that talking about it is by far the most fun. And so I'm still into Bruce. And I haven't quite had to do the breakup where I'm going to tell him I'm seeing other people. And that's going to be hard, because they're not, Bruce Lee is the most famous. I'm a martial arts writer. That's how I made my career. And he's the most famous martial artist to ever live. And so once you write about Bruce, everything's a little downhill after that.
What inspiration did you draw from him taking such a deep dive into his life, and how maybe has he made you better at what you do?
Um, well, one inspiration, I'm not sure this is a good one, is Bruce didn't take any shit. Like,
Yeah.
that was his defining quality. And it's so interesting because Asian Americans in Western culture for centuries, or at least decades, have been portrayed as a kind of bow-headed, stone-faced, inscrutable, just enduring an unbelievable suffering without complaint. And Bruce Lee was the exact opposite. He was like, "You insulted me, I'm going to punch you in the face." Um,
Yeah.
and so he made me a little more pugnacious. There's sometimes I have to calm down because I'm like, if I punch the principal of my son's school, it's not going to end well. But I'm sitting there thinking Bruce wouldn't take this shit. So I'm not sure that's good, but he definitely gave me a little bit of that. I think the most sort of the moral of the story of Bruce Lee is he never gave up. The only reason he's the first Asian American male actor to star in a Hollywood movie is because despite all his friends telling him it was impossible, despite the fact that basically it was impossible, it was a racist system that had zero interest in making a Chinese actor a Hollywood star, he never gave up. And the moral of the story is the impossible is possible sometimes if you're willing to pay the ultimate price. And so Bruce paid the ultimate price to achieve his ambition.
Yeah, and it was like he almost would always he seemed to be a guy who needed like an enemy to face. Whether that was, some screenwriters, like he needed an other to go up against and butt heads against. And he was a fighter from day one, really. So in a sense was like he put that obstacle in his way, and that's whether it's McQueen's fame. He was like, I'm going to, beat him. And then it's just, and everything, this, that, and the other. He always seemed to put that in his way. And that just drove him, maniacally. And also it kind of like drove him to the edge of his life, really.
Yeah, that's very insightful. The way I thought about it is he personalized conflict.
Yeah.
But you're right. He turned everything into a street fight. And so even though he really liked McQueen and they were good friends, the fact that McQueen was more famous than him meant that this was a fight to see who could be more famous. And McQueen recognized it because he was a bit of the same guy. McQueen had done that with Paul Newman. And so, who was better at martial arts? Everything was a competition. And that's how he pushed himself. And that was part of what sort of drove this incredible ambition. Because you would think most people would think to themselves, I'm Steve McQueen's trainer. I'm a first generation Chinese guy. No one knows what Kung Fu is. It's the 1960s. Korea was just 15 years ago. He's paying me $800 an hour. I've made it, right? Only Bruce Lee would be being paid $800 an hour to teach Steve McQueen and think, this sucks.
Yeah.
I need to be more famous than Steve McQueen. And that's unique to him. If I get $800 an hour to teach Steve McQueen, I would be done. The rest of the time I'd be drinking Mai Tais.
Yeah.
But, Bruce Lee had that kind of incredible ambition and drive. And you're right. He did it by thinking of everyththing as a fight.
Yeah. Well, Matthew, I want to be mindful of your time. Like, this is so great to get to talk to you about sort of your journey, your process of writing, your approach to the book, and of course talking a little bit about Bruce Lee here. The biography it's incredible, extensive. You're able to, the research you did and the way you were able to craft it comes through as just a really masterful biography. And I just want to thank you for the work. And where can people get more familiar with the book and also find you online so they can get more familiar with your work in the book?
If people want to find out more about me, they can go to my website, www.mattpolley.com, mattpoll.com. I'm also on Twitter at Matthew E. Polley, and you can look me up on Facebook, Matthew Polley, and you can email me at my website or reach out to me on Twitter. I love hearing from people who've read the book and enjoyed it. If you hated the book, you don't have to email me. But if you loved it, definitely want to hear from you. So yeah, that's how they can get to me. And the book's available everywhere. So run out and get a copy if you're interested.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Matt, for taking the time and to come on the show and talk about the book. So thanks for the work, and we'll be in touch for sure.
Appreciate it, Brendan. Thanks so much for having me on.
You got it. Take care. Thanks always to Hippocamp for the promotional support. And thanks to you for listening. You know what's funny? I actually forgot to tell you the name of the podcast at the top of the show. This is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, the show where I speak to narrative journalists, essayists, doc filmmakers, podcasters, radio producers, memoirists about the art and craft of telling true stories. But now you know. Be sure to head over to BrendanO'Mara.com to sign up for the monthly newsletter. It's real short, just a few book recommendations and podcast news. Once a month, no spam. Can't beat that. Or if you can, well, no, you can't. You cannot beat it. I hang out on Twitter at Brendan O'Mara and at CNFpod. Feel free to go like the Facebook page. I send out cool audiograms and quote cards on Instagram, so if you're feeling all kinds of froggy there, go for it. Brendan O'Mara there. You know, what is. That's gonna do it. I'm gonna go watch a Henry Rollins talk and try to get some motivation up in my brain. See ya!